The heat was a living thing. It pressed down from a pale, bleached sky and rose in shimmering waves from the cracked, red earth. The wind offered no relief. It was a hot breath that tasted of dust and salt, carrying the metallic scent of minerals baked for 1,000 years under the sun. At Boone Creek Ranch, the only sound that answered the wind was the weary, rhythmic squeal of the windmill, each turn a groan of protest from its dry metal joints. It was the sound of a world slowly dying of thirst. Elias Boone stood on the porch of the small ranch house, a place his father had built and his wife had made a home. Now it was just a building, holding the ghosts of better times. He watched the dust devil dance and die on the far side of the pasture, his jaw tight, his cattle, ribs showing like the rungs of a ladder, huddled in the scant shade of a few cottonwoods near the creek bed. The creek was more sand than water now, a cruel memory of the torrent it could be in a wet year. There had not been a wet year in a long time. The dust of a lone rider was a faint smudge on the horizon, moving away from them along the Santa Fe Trail. That was the last of his hired hands, paid off and let go. He could not afford them anymore. Not since Judge Caraway, the man who ran the town of Dusty Mesa with a fat hand and a thin smile, had bought the long-term lease on the spring that fed Boone Creek, bought it right out from under him. Caraway had offered to sell him water, of course, at a price that was nothing short of theft. Elias had refused. Pride was a poor currency when your herd was wasting away, but it was all he had left. The screen door creaked open behind him. Tommy, his nephew, stepped out. The boy was 14, all sharp elbows and knees, with a shock of blonde hair that fell into eyes the color of the summer sky. He was a good boy, quick to learn and quicker to help, but he had a shyness about him, a tendency to flinch at loud noises that Elias found both familiar and worrying. Tommy squinted toward the trail. "He is gone then?" he asked, his voice still holding the high, clear tones of childhood. Elias nodded. Not turning, "He is gone." The boy came to stand beside him, his shoulder barely reaching Elias's elbow. He leaned against the porch post, tracing a pattern in the dust with the toe of his worn boot. "What are we going to do, Uncle Elias?" he asked quietly. Elias let out a slow breath. He wished he had an answer that did not taste like ashes in his mouth. "We are going to work," he said, his voice rough. "We are going to pull the last of the herd closer to the house well. We are going to mend the fence on the north pasture. We are going to keep going until we cannot go anymore." Tommy was silent for a long moment. He knew better than to argue when his uncle used that tone. It was the same tone he had used the day they buried Aunt Sarah. A flat, hard sound like a stone dropped down a deep, dark well. From far off, a new column of dust was rising. It was not a rider, not a wagon. It was too small, too slow. It was the shuffling, patient dust of someone on foot. Elias watched it for a full minute, a knot of irritation tightening in his gut. He had enough trouble of his own without taking on some drifters. The figure was still miles away, a solitary speck moving through the immense, indifferent landscape. He grunted, turning his back on it. Let them walk. They would not find charity here. Hannah Gray had been walking since before sunrise. The world had resolved itself into a simple, brutal rhythm, the scuff of her worn shoes on the hard-packed dirt, the burn of the sun on the back of her neck, the constant, nagging thirst that made her swallow against a dry throat. She kept her eyes on the distant shape of the mountains, their purple and blue peaks a promise of something other than this endless expanse of red and brown. She carried her only possessions in a small cloth sack slung over her shoulder. It was not heavy, but after so many miles, its weight had become a part of her, a constant reminder of everything she had left behind. She was not running from something. That was what people thought, seeing a woman alone on the road. She was walking toward something. She had to believe that. She was walking toward a place where she could stop, where she could work, where she could be invisible enough to be safe. When she finally saw the ranch, it was like a mirage hardening into reality. A small, weathered house, a barn, a series of corrals, and the blessed, beautiful sound of a squeaking windmill. It meant water. It meant life. Her steps, which had slowed to a weary shuffle, quickened with a flicker of hope. She did not allow herself to feel more than that. Hope was a dangerous thing. It made you soft. As she drew closer, she saw a man on the porch, tall and broad-shouldered, his stance rigid. A boy stood beside him. They were watching her. She kept her expression placid, her gaze steady. She had learned long ago that looking away was a sign of weakness. You looked people in the eye, you kept your face calm, and you did not offer them any part of your story they did not ask for. You made yourself a smooth surface they could not get a grip on. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps, the dust settling around her ankles. She looked up at the man. His face was hard, carved by sun and worry, with eyes that were a startlingly clear blue. They were not friendly eyes. "I am looking for work," she said, her voice a little hoarse from disuse. "I am a good cook." Elias looked down at her. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe in her early 20s. Her face was smudged with dust, her lips cracked, but there was a stillness about her that was unusual, a kind of guarded composure that did not square with her desperate situation. She held his gaze without flinching. His first instinct, a raw and angry impulse born of his own misery, was to send her away. He did not have the food, the time, or the heart for a stray. Before he could speak, 2 men rode into the yard from the direction of town. They were neighbors, ranchers who sometimes shared a drink with him at Sal's place in Dusty Mesa. They pulled up their horses, tipping their hats. "Elias," one of them called out. "Just came from town. You hear the news?" "What news?" Elias asked, his attention still half on the woman at his feet. The afternoon stage was held up, over by Dry Needle Pass. They say the Henderson boys were behind it. The one said. The other man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "That is not the half of it. Sal says the sheriff thinks they had help. She said word is there was a woman with them, rode with them right up to the robbery, then took off on foot into the hills when the shooting started." Elias's gaze flickered back to the woman. On foot. A cold seed of suspicion took root. He saw the way his neighbors were looking at her now. Their eyes narrowed, taking in her dusty clothes and solitary state. The woman's expression did not change, but he saw a subtle tightening around her mouth, a stiffening in her shoulders. She had heard them. His neighbors, sensing the tension, made their excuses and rode on, leaving a cloud of dust and suspicion hanging in the hot, still air. Elias looked at her for a long, hard moment. He should tell her to go. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed it at him. A woman tied to outlaws was the last thing he needed. But then he looked at Tommy, who was staring at the woman with a wide-eyed mixture of curiosity and pity. And he looked at the woman herself, at the bone-deep weariness in her posture that her straight back could not quite hide. He thought of the empty kitchen, of the cold beans and hard biscuits he and Tommy had been eating for weeks. He thought of the relentless work ahead of them, fueled by nothing but bad coffee and grim determination. He let out a harsh sigh. "The cookhouse is empty," he said, his voice flat. "There is a storeroom in the back. You can sleep there tonight. We will see about tomorrow when it gets here." He did not offer a kind word. He did not ask her name or where she came from. He did not want to know. Knowing made things complicated, and his life was already a tangled mess. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, devoid of any pleading or excess gratitude. She shifted the small sack on her shoulder. Her name was Hannah Gray. Elias gestured with his chin toward a small outbuilding. "Tommy, show her." Tommy nodded. "Jumping down the steps. This way, ma'am," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Hannah followed the boy, her back straight, not looking back at the man on the porch. Elias watched her go, a bitter taste in his mouth. He had a feeling he had just invited a different kind of trouble to his door, one that might prove worse than drought or greedy neighbors. That night, Hannah lay on a thin pallet in the small, windowless storeroom. It smelled of dust, old flour, and mice. But the door had a latch on the inside, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the simple, profound relief of 4 solid walls around her. She had cleaned the small space as best she could, her movements economical and quiet. The boy, Tommy, had brought her a bucket of water and a plate with a piece of cornbread and some dried beef. He had set it down and fled as if she were a rattlesnake, but it was more food than she had seen in 2 days. She could hear the sounds of the ranch settling for the night, the low nicker of a horse, the distant call of a coyote, the ever-present creak of the windmill. Through the cracks in the wall boards, she could see the last of the light fade from the sky, leaving it a deep, star-strewn indigo. Outside, a change was coming. The wind, which had blown hot and steady from the south all day, began to shift. It came in hesitant puffs from the north now, carrying a different scent, a cool, damp smell of rain on distant stone. It was the smell of the storms that came in late summer, violent and sudden, promising life and threatening destruction in the same breath. Hannah sat up, pulling her thin blanket around her shoulders. She rubbed her arm, her fingers tracing the edge of a fading bruise just above her wrist. In the dim light filtering through the boards, the mark was a faint patch of yellow and pale green against her skin, a secret written in a language of pain. The new wind moaned around the corners of the small building, a lonely, unsettled sound. It felt like a warning. She closed her eyes, listening, waiting for the thunder to begin. Dawn came not as a gentle light, but as a slow dilution of the darkness. Long before the first hint of gray touched the eastern horizon, Hannah was awake. The cool, pre-dawn air was a blessing after the stifling heat of the previous day. In the cookhouse, she moved with a quiet efficiency that was second nature. She found the kindling and dry wood stacked neatly by the stove, a small consideration left by the boy, Tommy. The flare of the match was a small sun in the darkness, and soon the steady, hungry roar of the fire filled the small room. She worked by feel as much as by sight, her hands knowing the heft of the cast-iron skillet, the rough texture of the cornmeal, the smooth, cool surface of the water pump handle. She found a large pot of beans left from a previous meal, and set them on the back of the stove to warm, adding a dipper of water to keep them from scorching. By the time the sky outside had softened to a dusty rose, the air in the cookhouse was thick with the smells of brewing coffee and bacon crisping in the pan. Elias entered just as she was sliding a pan of cornbread into the oven. He filled the doorway, his presence sucking the air from the small space. He had not slept well. The wind had whispered of storms, and his mind had whispered of trouble. Seeing her there, a slim, straight-backed figure moving purposefully through the familiar space, did little to quiet his unease. The kitchen was cleaner than he had seen it in months, the surfaces wiped down, the pots scrubbed and hung in their proper places. He walked to the stove and picked up the coffee pot, pouring a cup of the steaming black liquid. He took a sip, his eyes scanning the room. It was good coffee, strong and not boiled to bitterness. He noted the neat stacks of plates, the tidy bin of flour, the way she had already set 2 places at the small wooden table. She had done more in an hour than he and Tommy managed in a week. He set his cup down, the ceramic making a sharp sound against the wood. "Lady, you are here only to cook." His voice was as dry as the packed earth outside. A statement of fact, not a welcome. This is a transaction. You will provide meals. I will provide a roof. That is all. Hannah did not turn to look at him. She was at the wash basin, her hands deep in a bucket of soapy water. "I understand," she said, her voice even. She reached for a heavy cloth to wipe down the counter, pulling her arms from the water and pushing up the damp sleeves of her dress to keep them dry. She twisted the cloth, wringing the water from it with a series of sharp, efficient motions. And Elias saw them. In the growing light of the morning, against the pale skin of her forearms, was a constellation of old bruises. They were ugly, mottled patches of faded purple and sickly yellow-green. One was a distinct, circular shape, the ghost of a thumbprint pressed cruelly into her flesh. They were not the marks of an accident, not the random bumps and scrapes of hard work. They were the clear, deliberate patterns of a hand that had gripped her, held her, hurt her. He went completely still. The sounds of the kitchen, the sizzle of bacon, the crackle of the fire seemed to recede into a distant hum. He had seen marks like that before, on men who had been in brutal fights, on animals caught in traps. To see them on her, on the slender arms of this quiet, self-contained woman, sent a jolt of something cold and unfamiliar through him. It was not pity. He had no room in his life for pity. It was a raw, visceral recognition of violence. He opened his mouth to ask, but the question died on his lips. What could he ask? What right did he have? He had just told her she was there only to cook. Her past was a locked room, and he had no desire to find the key. He swallowed, the coffee suddenly tasting bitter. He turned away, his movement stiff. "The coffee is fine," he said, his voice a full 2 notes lower than before, the harsh edge gone, replaced by something rougher, more uncertain. "Tommy will be in soon." Then he was gone, leaving Hannah alone in the warm, fragrant kitchen. She slowly rolled her sleeves back down, her expression unchanged, but for a single, fleeting moment, her hands had trembled. A new rhythm established itself at Boone Creek Ranch, a rhythm dictated by the bell Hannah rang from the cookhouse door. The days were still long and brutal, filled with the dusty, back-breaking work of a failing ranch. Elias and Tommy spent their hours reinforcing the fences that bordered Caraway's new water claim, their muscles aching with the effort of driving posts into the rock-hard ground. They branded the new spring calves, the smell of singed hair and the frightened bawling of the animals hanging heavy in the hot air. But now, the harshness of the day was punctuated by the simple, civilizing ritual of meals. Breakfast was hot and ready before the sun had fully risen. At noon, Hannah would bring a basket out to wherever they were working, filled with thick sandwiches and jars of cool water from the well. And at dusk, they would gather around the small table in the cookhouse, too tired for much talk, and eat a hot supper that filled their bellies and soothed some of the day's raw edges. Hannah's presence was a quiet one. She spoke little and never about herself, but the kitchen became her domain, a small island of order and cleanliness in a world of dust and decay. The spirit of the ranch, which had been as brittle and dry as the grass in the pastures, began to feel a little less hopeless. It was hard to feel completely defeated when you could smell fresh bread baking. Tommy, in particular, was drawn to the cookhouse. He would appear in the doorway, a book in his hand, and watch her work. At first, he was silent, but soon he began to ask questions. "How do you know how much flour to use? Why do you put salt in the coffee grounds?" Hannah answered him patiently, her voice soft. She showed him how to knead dough, how to shell peas, how to tell when the beans were cooked through. He was a quick learner, and his shy, boyish enthusiasm seemed to chip away at some of the icy reserve she held around herself. Elias kept his distance. He gave his orders in the morning and received his plate in the evening. The transactions brief and impersonal, but he watched. He saw the easy way the boy began to move around her, the small smiles she would give Tommy when he successfully measured out the cornmeal. And he saw other things, too. He noticed that if he entered the cookhouse too suddenly, her hand would fly to her chest, a quick, startled gesture. If his voice rose in frustration as he worked on a piece of stubborn machinery, he would see her through the window, her body going rigid, her hands stilling over her work. She was like a wild creature, constantly alert for danger, her calm a thin sheet of ice over a deep, turbulent pool of fear. He remembered the bruises. He had not seen them again. She was careful to keep her sleeves down, but the image was burned into his mind. He also noticed the storeroom door. He had checked it one night, concerned about coyotes. It latched securely from the inside, but there was no way to bar it from the outside. She was not locked in. The thought had not even occurred to him. But he realized with a strange pang that, for her, that small detail might mean everything. The seeds of suspicion, once planted, had taken root in the dry soil of Dusty Mesa. The two ranch hands Elias had let go had found work on a neighboring spread, and they carried their story with them. They stopped at Sal's eatery for a beer and a meal, and they talked. They talked about the stagecoach robbery, and they talked about the strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere at Boone Creek Ranch on the very same day. A woman on foot, alone, with no baggage to speak of. It did not take long for the story to grow. By the end of the week, the rumor was that Elias Boone was harboring a criminal, a woman who belonged to the Henderson gang. The description of the phantom woman grew more detailed with each telling. Her hair color, her height, her clothing, all shifting until they matched Hannah's description perfectly. The whispers followed the dusty roads from one ranch to another, a poison spreading through the community. Elias was not a popular man, his temper and pride having isolated him over the years. People were ready to believe the worst. One afternoon, a wagon pulled into the yard. It was Maya Redbird. She was a native woman, a widow who lived on a small plot of land just outside of town and made the best blue cornbread in the territory. She was a woman of few words, but her eyes missed nothing. She got down from the wagon, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle that smelled of earth and warm bread. Hannah came out of the cookhouse to meet her. Tommy, who had seen Maya arrive, came running from the barn. He loved her bread. Maya handed the bundle to Hannah. "A gift for the new cook," she said, her voice low and melodic. "I heard Boone Creek had a new cook." Hannah took the offering. "Thank you. That is very kind." Maya's dark, intelligent eyes moved over Hannah's face, then flickered down to her arms. Hannah was wearing a short-sleeved dress today, the heat being too much for anything else. The bruises were visible, faded now to a pale yellow, but still there. Maya's expression did not change, but her gaze lingered for a fraction of a second. She reached into a pocket in her skirt and pulled something out. It was a simple string of polished cedar beads, small and dark, glowing with a soft luster. She held it out to Hannah. "Keep this," she said softly, "to remind you of what has not been broken." Hannah looked from the beads to the woman's face. In Maya's eyes, she saw not pity, but a deep, quiet understanding. It was a look that bypassed all the questions, all the suspicions, and went straight to the heart of the matter. It was a look that said, "I see you're hurt, and I am not afraid of it." For the first time since she had arrived at Boone Creek, Hannah felt a crack in the wall she had built around herself. A single, genuine tear welled in her eye, and she blinked it away quickly before it could fall. She took the string of beads, their smooth, woody texture a comfort in her palm. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Maya simply nodded, then turned to Tommy and offered him a small, sweet cake from her basket, her face breaking into a rare, warm smile. A seed of trust, small and fragile, had just been planted in the hard, unforgiving ground of the ranch, and in the distance, far to the north, the sky was beginning to bruise with the promise of a storm. The town of Dusty Mesa baked under the afternoon sun, its single dusty street a river of pale brown heat. Inside Sal's eatery, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and fried onions. It was the hub of the town, the place where news, gossip, and trouble were born and traded like currency. Today, the topic of conversation was Elias Boone and his mysterious new cook. Noah Pike sat at a corner table, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. He was a man built of thick, solid muscle, with a face that looked like it had been in a few arguments and won them all. He worked for Judge Carraway, a role that was part foreman, part enforcer, and all loyalty. He listened as the talk swirled around him, adding a word here and there to steer the current. "A woman just shows up out of the desert the same day the Henderson boys hit the stage," he said, his voice a low rumble. It does make a man wonder. He took a long drink, letting the implication hang in the air. Judge Carraway himself sat at his usual table by the window, observing the room with an air of benign ownership. He was a large man, his bulk contained by a fine wool suit that seemed out of place in the dusty town. He was not an official judge, not elected or appointed by any government, but he had presided over the town's affairs for so long, settling disputes and arranging deals, that the title had stuck. He controlled the town's largest freight business, held the deeds to half the properties, and now he was making his move on the water. Boone Creek was the last independent source in the area, and he wanted it. The rumor Noah Pike was carefully nurturing was a useful tool, a lever to apply pressure. A man worried about being accused of harboring a fugitive might be more willing to sell his land cheap. The judge smiled to himself, a small, reptilian curve of his lips. Everything had its price. The effects of that talk reached the ranch on Sunday. Tommy came back from his weekly lesson with Father Deacon Miller. His face clouded over. He put his Bible on the kitchen table without a word and went straight to the barn to do his chores. Elias found him there, pitching hay with a frantic, angry energy. Elias leaned against the stall door, his arms crossed. "Something on your mind, son?" Tommy stopped, jamming the pitchfork into the hay bale. He would not look at his uncle. "The other boys," he muttered, the words tight and clipped. They were talking. About what Elias's voice was patient, but there was a hard edge to it. "About her," Tommy said, finally looking up. His eyes were bright with unshed tears of frustration. "They said you are keeping a criminal here. They said we are living with a woman who has no name, no history. They called her a thief." A dark fire ignited in Elias's gut. It was a familiar rage, hot and swift. The same anger he felt when he looked at his thirsty cattle or thought of Judge Carraway's smug face. It was an anger against the injustice of the world, against the petty, cruel tongues of small men who found pleasure in tearing others down. He slammed his open palm against the wooden wall of the barn. The sound was like a gunshot in the enclosed space. "Why, those little buzzards!" he roared, his voice bouncing off the rafters. "I will go into town and teach their fathers some manners they will not soon forget. I will not have my family." He stopped. A movement at the barn door had caught his eye. It was Hannah. She had come to fetch a bucket and had frozen at the sound of his shouting. Her face was pale, her body rigid. Her hands were clenched into small, white-knuckled fists at her sides. And her eyes, when they met his, were wide and empty, as if she were looking at something 1,000 miles away. She took a half-step back, a small, instinctive retreat, a flinch that was not of the body, but of the soul. The sight of her raw terror doused his anger like a bucket of cold water. He saw in that instant what his rage looked like from the outside. It was not a righteous fire. It was just a loud, violent noise. The same kind of noise that had surely preceded the blows that had left those marks on her arms. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was acting just like the men who had hurt her. His shoulders slumped. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the anger draining out of him, leaving a hollow ache in its place. He lowered his head for a moment, gathering himself. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, so quiet that Tommy and Hannah had to strain to hear it. "Tommy," he said, his voice raspy, "go inside. Supper will be ready soon." Tommy, startled by the sudden shift, hesitated for a second, then nodded and hurried toward the house, casting a worried glance back at his uncle. Elias was alone with Hannah in the suddenly vast silence of the barn. She had not moved. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself. He kept his distance, his hands open at his sides, a gesture he was not even aware he was making. "I was not angry with you," he said softly. "I was angry for you, and for the boy." Hannah's gaze slowly came back into focus. The emptiness receded, replaced by the familiar guarded stillness. She gave a small, jerky nod. He tried to explain, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate in his mouth. "My wife," Sarah, she used to say my temper was a runaway train. I did not realize it could scare people, he finished lamely, the apology hanging unspoken between them. She watched him for another long moment. Then her hands slowly uncurled. She walked past him to the water pump, her movements deliberate. She did not say a word. She did not need to. He had seen her fear, and he had stepped back from it. It was a bigger conversation than any words could have managed. That evening, the meal was the quietest yet. The air was thick with things unsaid. Tommy ate quickly, his eyes darting between Elias and Hannah. Elias ate methodically, his gaze fixed on his plate. Hannah seemed to be in a world of her own, moving and eating with a detached grace. Finally, Elias pushed his empty plate back. He cleared his throat. The coffee is not as bitter as it was yesterday, he said to no one in particular. It was a clumsy offering, a peace treaty written on a napkin. It was a bricklayer's attempt at poetry. But it was also the kindest thing he had said to her since she arrived. Hannah looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She simply nodded. I used less chicory. The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of anger or tension. It was the silence of a truce, a fragile space where two wounded people were learning to walk without startling each other. Later, as Hannah was cleaning up, Tommy came into the cookhouse. He was supposed to be in bed, but he lingered by the stove. Can you show me how to make the bread rise overnight? He asked in a low voice. The kind that is all puffy in the morning. Hannah's face softened. Of course. She took out a large bowl and began to measure flour, explaining the magic of yeast, of warmth and time. She moved around the small kitchen, gathering ingredients, her earlier stillness replaced by the comfortable rhythm of her work. As she reached for a tin of salt on a high shelf, her sleeve brushed against a stack of metal buckets, sending them crashing to the floor. The metallic clang was deafening in the small space. Hannah froze. The bowl of flour slipped from her fingers, her hands flying up to her head in a protective gesture. A low, strangled sound escaped her lips. Her whole body was trembling, her knuckles white. Tommy stared, his heart pounding. He saw her fear, raw and real. He did not understand it, but he knew it was not about the fallen buckets. His first instinct was to run and get his uncle, but he looked at Hannah, curled in on herself, and another instinct took over, the simple, uncomplicated kindness he had learned from his late aunt. He walked quietly to the stove, where a pot of milk was still warm. He poured a mug full and carried it carefully to her. He did not speak. He just held it out. Hannah slowly lowered her hands. Her eyes were wide with a remembered terror. She saw the boy, his face etched with concern, offering the warm mug. She took it, her trembling hands sloshing a little of the milk onto the floor. She took a sip. The warmth spread through her. A small anchor in a sea of panic. She looked at Tommy, and for the first time, she gave him a true, though fragile, smile. Thank you, Tommy, she whispered. The wave of gossip Noah Pike had started in town had now become a tide. It lapped at the edges of every conversation, fueled by fear and suspicion. It finally gave Judge Carraway the leverage he needed. A few days later, the town sheriff rode out to the ranch. He was a decent man, but he owed his position to the judge. He stood on the porch, twisting his hat in his hands, his face a mask of official discomfort. Elias, he began. I'm sorry to trouble you, but Judge Carraway and some of the other townsfolk are concerned. There are rumors about your cook. Elias's face was like stone. I do not listen to rumors. The sheriff shifted his weight. Be that as it may, the judge has made a formal proposal. He wants to organize a search of your property, to look for any evidence related to the stagecoach robbery, to, clear the air, so to speak. Elias knew exactly what it was. It was not about a robbery. It was about intimidation. It was about Carraway putting his brand on Elias's life, on his home. It was a public declaration that the judge could and would walk anywhere he pleased. It was about the water. It was always about the water. He looked past the sheriff, toward the hazy outline of dusty mesa. He thought of Tommy's face, crumpled with shame. He thought of Hannah's eyes, empty with fear. A cold, hard resolve settled in his chest, replacing the hot rage he was so used to. This was not a fire he could shout at. This was a wall he had to stand against. He turned his gaze back to the sheriff, his blue eyes as cold and clear as ice. "Tell the judge to bring whoever he wants," he said, his voice low and steady. "Let them try." The afternoon air grew heavy and thick, charged with an unnatural stillness. The incessant creak of the windmill slowed, then stopped altogether, leaving an unnerving silence. The sky, which had been a pale, washed-out blue, began to take on a strange, yellowish-brown tint at the western edge. Elias, mending a leather harness on the porch, looked up and felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He had seen skies like this before. They were a lie, a calm mask hiding a violent face. Inside the cookhouse, Hannah was rolling out dough for the evening meal. She, too, felt the change. The air was hard to breathe, and a low hum seemed to vibrate just at the edge of her hearing. Tommy came in from the corral, his face flushed. "It is getting dark," he said, his voice holding a note of awe. "And there is no wind." Elias came to the doorway. "Both of you, get inside the house," he ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. "Not the cookhouse, the main house. Tie down anything that can blow away. Now." The first gust of wind hit the ranch like a physical blow. It was not a breeze. It was a solid wall of air and sand that screamed through the yard, tearing at the loose shingles on the barn roof. The world outside the windows dissolved into a churning, opaque brown maelstrom. Dust, fine as flour, seeped through the cracks in the walls, coating every surface in a gritty film. The house groaned under the assault, the wooden frame trembling. They huddled in the main room, listening to the roar of the storm. It was impossible to see more than a few feet from the windows. The sound was immense, a constant, deafening shriek that seemed to go on forever. And then, through the noise, came a new sound, a sharp, metallic clang from the direction of the barn, followed a moment later by the terrified, high-pitched bawling of the young calves penned inside. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his face a grim mask. "The lantern! I left a lantern hanging in there." He grabbed a heavy coat and pulled it on, wrapping a cloth around the lower half of his face. "Stay here," he yelled over the storm's fury. "Both of you, do not leave the house." He threw open the door and was immediately swallowed by the swirling brown chaos. Hannah and Tommy watched from the window, their faces pressed against the glass. They could just make out Elias's form, a dark shape struggling against the wind, heading for the barn. And then they saw it. A flicker of angry orange light bloomed within the barn's dark interior, a hungry, growing flower in the heart of the storm. "Fire!" The word was a choked whisper from Tommy's lips. Hannah's mind went silent and clear. All the small, cautious fears of her daily life were burned away by the raw, immediate terror of the flames. She saw the new calves, the ones Tommy had so carefully tended, and she saw the barn, the heart of the ranch, being eaten alive. She ran to the water buckets by the door. Tommy grabbed her arm. "Uncle Elias said to stay here." "We cannot," Hannah said, her voice steady and sure. "The calves." She pulled the door open, the wind nearly tearing it from her grasp. She filled 2 buckets from the rain barrel, the water sloshing over the sides. The storm was a physical entity, trying to push her back, to knock her down. She lowered her head and pushed into it, her slim frame surprisingly strong. Elias had just reached the barn when he saw her. She was a frantic, determined figure, bent low against the wind, wrestling with the heavy, sloshing buckets. "Hannah, go back!" he roared, his voice ripped away by the wind. "Stand back." It was an order born of pure, protective terror. He could not fight the fire and worry about her. She did not seem to hear him, or if she did, she ignored him. She reached the barn door, the heat and smoke billowing out to meet her. Inside, a pile of dry hay near the side wall was burning fiercely, the flames licking their way up the dry wooden planks. Elias was already inside, trying to beat back the blaze with a heavy horse blanket, the smoke thick and acrid. Hannah did not hesitate. She threw the contents of one bucket at the base of the fire, the water hissing and turning to steam. The flames faltered for a moment, then roared back to life. Tommy, seeing her go, acted on pure instinct. He ran not toward the fire, but around to the small side gate of the calf pen. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb, and pulled the gate open, shouting and waving his arms to drive the panicked, bleeding animals out into the relative safety of the open corral. Elias saw what the boy was doing and felt a surge of pride cut through his fear. He redoubled his efforts, choking on the thick smoke, his eyes streaming. Hannah appeared at his side, thrusting the second bucket of water into his hands before turning and running back out into the storm. For more. Together, they were a desperate, frantic team. He would beat the flames down with a blanket, and she would follow with a splash of water, dousing the embers, bucket by bucket, blow by blow. They fought the fire back. It seemed to last an eternity, but it was over in minutes. The main fire was out, leaving a smoldering, stinking pile of blackened hay and a charred patch on the barn wall. The immediate danger was past. The wind began to lose its furious edge, the roar subsiding to a low moan. Elias leaned against a post, gasping for air, his lungs burning. He turned to look for Hannah. She was on her knees just inside the doorway, racked by a terrible, deep cough, her body convulsing with the effort to draw a clean breath. A wave of pure, unreasoning fear washed over him. He saw her small, crumpled form, heard the awful, liquid sound of her coughing, and his control snapped. "Hannah!" he shouted, his voice raw and loud, amplified by the barn's acoustics. "I told you to stay back. Are you trying to get yourself killed? What were you thinking?" At the sound of his raised voice, her coughing stopped. Her body went rigid. She did not look up. Instead, she curled in on herself, her arms coming up to shield her head in a gesture of instinctive, absolute self-preservation. She made herself small, a target bracing for a blow. The storm outside had dumped a brief, violent squall of rain in its final throes, and her dress was soaked through. As she cowered, the wet fabric clung to her back and shoulders, revealing what her clothes and quiet demeanor had always hidden. Her skin was a roadmap of old pain. Faint, ghost-like bruises and faded discolorations littered her back, a terrible, spidery network of past hurts. They were old injuries, almost invisible, but in that moment, under his horrified gaze, they were as clear as fresh wounds. Her voice, when it came, was a ragged, breathless whisper, barely audible over the dying wind. "Do not," she gasped, each word a struggle. "Do not raise your voice. It always started like that." The words struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. He saw it all in a flash of terrible understanding. The flinching, the guarded eyes, the bruises he had seen on her arm. His loud, fear-driven anger had not been a comfort or a protection. It had been a trigger, a key that unlocked a room full of horrors inside her mind. He was no better than the man, or men, who had put those marks on her. He let the heavy, scorched blanket drop from his hand. He slowly walked over to her, his boots making no sound on the damp earth. He knelt down, not beside her, but a few feet away, deliberately making himself lower than she was. He rested his hands on his knees, his posture open and unthreatening. He waited until she slowly, hesitantly, lowered her arms and dared to look at him. Her eyes were wide, swimming with a terror that had nothing to do with the fire. "I am sorry," he said. His voice was incredibly soft, a stark contrast to his earlier shout. It was a simple, profound admission of his own blindness. "I am so sorry." A single tear traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek, She did not speak. She just watched him, breathing in the clean, rain-washed air, as the last of the storm rumbled away into the distance. That night, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. The storm had broken the heat, leaving the air cool and clean. The moon shone down from a sky scrubbed clear of clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the yard. The damage had been minimal. A charred section of wall, a few lost shingles. They had been lucky. They ate supper in the main house, not the cookhouse. It felt wrong to be separated after what they had been through. The silence was different now. It was not a silence of distance, but one of contemplation. After Tommy had gone to bed, Elias found Hannah sitting on the porch steps, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was holding the string of cedar beads Maya had given her, running them through her fingers. He sat on the top step, a few feet away from her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just listened to the night sounds, the chirp of crickets, the sigh of the wind through the damp cottonwoods. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice low. "Noah Pike," he said. It was not a question. Hannah's fingers stilled on the beads. She did not seem surprised. She looked out at the moonlit pasture, her profile etched against the darkness. "I was a cook," she said, her voice flat and distant, as if telling someone else's story, for a crew laying track for the railroad. He was the foreman. She paused, and Elias did not push. He just waited. "He was a hard man," she continued. "He liked things his own way. He expected service, beyond the cooking. I said no." The simple words landed in the quiet night with a weight of stones. It started with a loud voice. She whispered, "Like tonight." Then it was a hand on my arm. Then a closed fist. I stayed for a long time, longer than I should have. I had nowhere else to go. One day, I just walked away. I took what I could carry and I walked. "And the stagecoach robbery?" Elias asked gently. She shook her head. "I was on the same road. That is all. I heard the shots, and I hid in the rocks. I never saw them, but I saw what they dropped." A heavy satchel. It had a tag on it, from Judge Carraway's freight company, addressed to Noah Pike, at the railhead. Elias went cold. He finally understood. It was not just about the water. Carraway was not just trying to squeeze him off his land. Pike had left the railroad job to work for Carraway a few months ago. The satchel was a bribe, a payoff, and Hannah, by pure, terrible coincidence, was the one person who knew about it, the one person who could connect the powerful judge to the foreman with the violent hands. Carraway did not just want to silence the rumors about the robbery. He wanted to silence the one person who knew the truth behind it. He wanted to discredit her, to bury her, to make sure no one would ever believe a word she said. Elias looked at her, at this quiet, resilient woman who had walked out of one nightmare and straight into another. The storm that had ripped through the ranch that afternoon was nothing. It was just wind and dust, the real storm. The one that threatened to tear all of them apart was just now gathering its strength on the horizon. They came 3 days after the storm. The sun was bright, the air scrubbed clean, but the arrival of 4 riders cast a long, dark shadow across the yard. Noah Pike was in the lead, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. Beside him rode the town sheriff, his face set in a miserable, apologetic grimace. 2 other men, hard-faced and unfamiliar, flanked them. They reined in their horses, and the sudden silence felt louder than the storm had been. Elias stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He had been expecting them. He moved without haste, his body calm, but a cold, watchful intensity burned in his eyes. Hannah appeared in the doorway of the cookhouse, her hands white where she gripped a wooden spoon. Tommy stood frozen by the water pump, a bucket dangling from his hand. The sheriff was the one who spoke, his voice strained. "Elias, we have a warrant to search the premises." He held out a piece of paper. It looked flimsy and unofficial. The ink smudged. The seal of the town magistrate, a man wholly owned by Judge Carraway. pressed crookedly at the bottom. Elias did not take the paper. He looked past the sheriff, his gaze locking with Noah Pike's. Pike returned the look with a lazy, arrogant smirk. "A warrant," Elias said, his voice level. "Fine, but we will do this by the book." He turned his head slightly. "Tommy, ride into town. You will find Father Deacon Miller at the church and Sal at her eatery. Tell them Elias Boone requests their presence here as official witnesses. Tell them the sheriff is conducting a search, and I want it done with the eyes of God and the community watching." The sheriff's face paled. "Elias, that is not necessary." "I think it is," Elias said, his voice dropping, taking on a hard, unyielding edge. "Go on, son." Tommy dropped the bucket and ran for the small pony he kept in the corral, his fear giving way to a sense of solemn purpose. Pike's smirk tightened. He did not like this. Witnesses complicated things, but he could not object without looking like he had something to hide. They waited in the tense, sun-drenched silence, the only sound the buzzing of flies and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. Sal and Father Miller arrived together in Sal's buckboard wagon, Tommy riding alongside them. Sal, a stout woman with no-nonsense eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, climbed down with an audible grunt. She gave Pike a look that could have curdled milk. Father Miller, a thin, gentle man whose quiet presence carried more weight than Pike's bluster, followed her, his expression one of deep concern. "All right, Sheriff," Sal said, her voice like gravel. "You wanted to search. We are here to watch. Let us get on with it." The search was a brutish, clumsy affair. Pike's men moved through the small ranch house first, pulling blankets from the beds. Looking under the sparse furniture, they found nothing. Then they moved to the barn, kicking over hay bales and rattling the tack on the walls. All the while, Elias stood silent and watchful, his arms crossed, with Sal and the minister standing a few feet behind him. Finally, they came to the cookhouse and the small storeroom where Hannah slept. This was what they had come for. Pike pushed his way into the tiny room, his bulk filling the space. He kicked at her thin pallet and rummaged through the small wooden crate that held her few belongings. He pulled out a worn, grease-stained notebook. "What is this?" he said, holding it up with a sneer. "Some kind of code." Elias stepped forward. "That is her recipe book." Pike laughed, a short, ugly sound. He flipped through the pages, which were filled with Hannah's neat, careful script. Recipes for bread and stews were interspersed with lists of goods and their prices: flour, 5 cents a pound; salt pork, 12 cents; lard, 8. It was the simple, practical ledger of a woman trying to run a kitchen on a tight budget. It was so mundane, so utterly innocent, that it made Pike's search seem ridiculous. He tossed the book onto the floor in disgust. "There is nothing here!" As they filed out of the storeroom, Pike stopped in front of Hannah, who stood by the cookhouse door, her face a pale, still mask. He looked down at her arms, where the last faint traces of the old bruises were still visible. He leaned in close, his voice a low, taunting whisper meant for all to hear. "You know, some women, they get themselves into trouble. They are clumsy. They fall down a lot. Then they cry wolf and try to blame a good man for their own foolishness." He smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. "You probably did that to yourself." A muscle jumped in Elias's jaw. He took a half-step forward, his hands clenching into fists, the old, hot rage surging through him. He was going to hit him. He knew it was what Pike wanted, an excuse to escalate, but in that moment, he did not care. But before he could move, something small and swift shot past him. It was Tommy, the boy, who flinched at loud noises and was shy with strangers, planted himself directly in front of Hannah, his thin body a fragile shield. He did not say a word. He just stood there, his chin up, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective loyalty, glaring up at the big, brutal man. The raw, unexpected courage of the act stunned everyone into silence. Pike, who had been braced for a fight with Elias, looked down at the boy with a flicker of genuine confusion. He had no idea what to do. Hitting a boy was a line even he would not cross in front of the town minister. For a long, silent second, the entire yard was held captive by the defiant stance of one small child. Pike was the first to recover. He let out a harsh, dismissive sound, a poor attempt to cover his surprise. He turned on his heel. "Let us go," he growled at his men. "We are done here." They mounted their horses and rode out, leaving a trail of dust and simmering hostility behind. Sal walked over and put a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You are a good boy." "Tommy Boone," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "You have got your aunt's heart." That afternoon, Maya Redbird came by. It was not unusual. She often brought herbs or news from her side of the valley. She found Elias reinforcing the charred wall of the barn. She dismounted and watched him work for a moment before she spoke. "They were here," she said. It was a statement, not a question. Elias drove a nail home with a single, powerful blow. They found nothing. Maya walked toward the cookhouse, her eyes scanning the ground. Her gaze fell on the storeroom door. She tilted her head, her nostrils flaring slightly, like a deer testing the wind. "There is a new smell," she said quietly. "Man smell and lamp oil. The cheap kind, with a bad stink. The kind Noah Pike uses." Elias stopped working. He came and stood beside her. "They left something behind," Maya said, her voice certain, something that was not theirs. She met his eyes, her own dark and serious. "Do not fight them with your fists." "Elias." "They are good at that. It is the only thing they are good at. You fight them with the truth. You fight them with your neighbors." After she left, Elias told Hannah and Tommy to stay on the porch. He walked to the storeroom and pushed the door open. The small space was just as Pike had left it, a mess of kicked-around belongings. But Maya was right. The faint, cloying smell of cheap lamp oil hung in the air. He knelt by Hannah's pallet. He ran his hand underneath it, and his fingers brushed against a rough cloth bag. He pulled it out. It was a small but heavy money pouch, tied at the neck with a piece of new-looking cord. He looked at the knot. It was a quick, clumsy tie, not the neat, practical knot a woman would use. He looked at the dusty floor, amid the scuffed prints of his own boots and Hannah's smaller shoes. He could see the clear outline of a third set of prints, large and wide, with a distinctive wear pattern on the heel. The kind of print a heavy man who spent a lot of time in the saddle would leave. He took the bag outside, holding it by the cord. He did not need to open it. He knew what was inside. Planted evidence, a dirty trick in a dirty fight. Over the next few days, a subtle shift began in Dusty Mesa. Sal, spurred by what she had seen at the ranch, began to talk to the other shopkeepers and ranchers who came into her eatery. She spoke of Caraway's greed, of his attempt to control the water that they all depended on. "If he can choke off Boone Creek," she would say, wiping down the bar with a rag, "he can choke off any one of us next." It started as a murmur, but it grew into a current of shared resentment, a quiet, stubborn resistance taking root. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elias and Hannah sat on the porch. A cool wind was blowing, rattling the leaves of the cottonwoods. Elias finally broke the long silence between them. "I am not a man who knows how to make people feel safe," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He was looking at his own hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of hard work. "My temper, it is a hard thing to live with. For me, for others. I know that. I cannot promise to be a gentle man. It is not in my nature. But I will stand next to you in this. I will not let them take you." Hannah was quiet for a long time, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. She did not look at him when she answered, her voice soft but firm. "I do not need a protector," she said. "I have had men who wanted to protect me. Protection can feel a lot like a cage." She turned her head then, and her clear, steady gaze met his in the twilight. I do not need a man to stand in front of me. I need someone who will not run when the storm hits. I need someone who will not abandon me to face it alone. It was not a promise of love. It was something more fundamental, a pact of survival, a recognition of a shared, stubborn will to endure. In the deepening dusk, they looked at each other, and for the first time, they were not just a rancher and his cook. They were two people standing together on a small patch of ground, waiting for the next assault. It came 2 days later. The sheriff rode out again. Alone this time. His face was gray with weariness. He looked like a man who hated his own job. "Elias," he said, his voice heavy. "Judge Carraway has issued a formal complaint. He has an anonymous witness who claims they saw this woman, Hannah Gray, with the Henderson gang just before the robbery. He has issued a warrant for her arrest and transport to the county seat for questioning." Elias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. It was the final move, the checkmate. Once Carraway had her away from the ranch, away from him, she would disappear into the system, and her voice would never be heard again. He looked at the cookhouse, where he could see her silhouette through the window. He thought of her quiet strength, of Tommy's fierce loyalty, of the simple, decent life they were trying to build in the wreckage of his own. The anger was there, a hot coal in his chest, but it was a different kind of anger now. It was focused, cold, and clear. He turned back to the sheriff. "Tell Judge Carraway we will not resist his warrant," he said, his voice ringing with a strange, new authority. "But we will not be coming alone. You want to question Hannah Gray based on the word of a secret witness? Then you will do it in front of the whole town. We will have a town meeting, in the open, where everyone can see and hear. Let his witness come forward and speak their piece in the light of day. We will be there. Tell him we will all be there." The gathering did not take place in a courtroom, but in the wide, dusty space before the town's meeting hall, a simple wooden structure with a small steeple. The people of Dusty Mesa and the surrounding ranches stood in a loose, shifting semicircle, their faces a mixture of grim curiosity and nervous anticipation. Above them, the sky was a bruised, unsettled canvas of gray and purple clouds, piled high on the horizon, threatening a storm that had not yet decided to break. The air was heavy, charged with electricity and unspoken questions. Father Deacon Miller stood on the top step of the hall, his thin frame a point of calm in the swirling currents of emotion. He held a Bible in his hands, not as a weapon, but as an anchor. He had agreed to preside, to lend the proceedings an air of solemnity that a warrant from Judge Carraway could never provide. Elias, Hannah, and Tommy stood together at the edge of the crowd. Elias was a figure carved from stone, his face unreadable, his stance solid and unmoving. Tommy stood close to him, his initial fear replaced by a quiet, determined gravity. Hannah was between them. She was not hiding. Her back was straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She wore a simple gray dress, and her eyes, clear and steady, scanned the faces in the crowd, missing nothing. Judge Carraway arrived last, as was his custom. He walked with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who believes he owns the ground he walks on. Noah Pike and 2 of his men followed a few paces behind, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. Carraway took his place on the steps, a few feet from the minister, and held up a hand for silence. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone designed to soothe and persuade. "We are gathered here today for a somber purpose. The rule of law, the very fabric of our peaceful community, has been threatened. A violent crime was committed, and a shadow of suspicion has fallen upon a stranger in our midst." He gestured vaguely toward Hannah without looking at her. "All we ask, all we seek, is the truth, for the safety of our families." He let the words hang in the air before continuing. "This situation highlights a greater concern, our most precious resource. Water is a source of strife and uncertainty. In these difficult times, we need strong, centralized management. Therefore, I propose the formation of a town water commission to oversee the fair and orderly distribution of water to all, naturally, as a service to the community I love. I would be willing to chair such a committee. It was a masterful performance. In a single speech, he had positioned himself as a protector of the peace and the benevolent patriarch who would solve their water problems, all while painting Hannah as a threat and Elias, by extension, as a fool who harbored her. Father Miller stepped forward, his quiet voice cutting through the judge's persuasive rhetoric. "Judge Caraway, you have made a serious accusation. You claim to have a witness. Let them come forward now, before God and this community, and speak their name and their truth." A nervous silence fell over the crowd. Caraway's smile tightened. He had not expected this public challenge. The witness, of course, did not exist. He was about to speak when another voice, low and melodic, came from the crowd. "Perhaps there is other evidence to consider first." Maya Redbird walked forward, parting the crowd like a canoe through still water. She held up a small object for all to see. It was a short piece of grimy cord. "I am no lawman," she said, her gaze fixed on the judge, "but I know the work of a man's hands. This cord was used to tie a money bag found in the cookhouse storeroom at Boone Creek Ranch. It smells of cheap lamp oil, the same oil Noah Pike buys from the general store every Tuesday, and the knot is a clumsy one, tied in a hurry by a man with thick fingers. Not the work of a woman who ties neat knots every day of her life." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a small thing, but it was a crack in Caraway's story. Before Pike could respond, Tommy Boone stepped forward, his heart pounding against his ribs. He held a large piece of paper, blackened with charcoal. I saw the boot prints on the floor," he said, his voice trembling slightly but clear, "in the storeroom. After they left, they were big. I took my paper and some charcoal, and I did a rubbing." He held up the paper. It showed the distinct impression of a large, worn boot heel. He then pointed a shaking finger directly at Noah Pike. "They are the same as the boots you are wearing right now." Pike looked down at his feet as if they had betrayed him. The crowd shifted, their eyes moving from the boy's earnest face to Pike's dusty boots and back again. The murmur grew louder. Sal was the next to speak. She pushed her way to the front, waving a piece of paper in her hand. "This here is a freight invoice from Judge Caraway's own company," she announced, her voice booming across the clearing. "It is for a shipment of cash, a payroll they called it, sent to the railhead camp where Noah Pike used to work, and it is dated the very same day the stagecoach was robbed. The same payroll, I imagine. That was in the satchel the Henderson boys stole." The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that had nothing to do with a mysterious woman and everything to do with money and deceit. The crowd was no longer a passive audience. They were leaning in, their expressions hardening, their gazes turning from suspicion of Hannah to accusation of the men on the steps. It was then that Hannah herself moved forward. She walked to the center of the clearing and stood before them all. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a woman with a story to tell. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with a quiet, factual clarity that was more powerful than any shout. "I was not with the men who robbed the stage," she said, her voice carrying in the heavy air. "But I was there. I was a cook at that railhead camp. I know it well." She turned her gaze on Noah Pike, who stood frozen, a look of disbelief on his face. "I know that the door to warehouse number 2 has a large, dark burn mark near the bottom hinge, from a lantern fire last spring. I know that the water in the barrel by the foreman's office always tastes of oil, because the barrel has a slow leak and it sits on a stained patch of ground. And I know the crate that payroll came in. It was stenciled on the side with a code. 2 letters and a number, X3. The crowd erupted. These were details no stranger could invent, no liar could guess. They were the small, hard facts of a real place, a real time. They were the truth. Noah Pike saw the trap closing. He saw the faces of the townspeople turned against him, saw the cold fury in Elias's eyes, saw Caraway taking a subtle step away from him on the porch. Panic, raw and ugly. broke through his composure. With a roar of rage, he drew his pistol, the metallic rasp of the gun clearing its holster shockingly loud. He waved it wildly. At the crowd, at Elias, at Hannah. "Stay back," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "All of you, stay back." The crowd recoiled, a wave of fear washing over them. Women screamed. Men pushed their families behind them. And in that moment, the sky broke. A blinding fork of lightning split the heavens, striking a tall pine tree on the hill just behind the meeting hall. The crack of thunder that followed was instantaneous and immense, a physical blow that shook the ground and rattled the windows. The horses tied to the hitching posts screamed and reared, pulling at their reins. The world dissolved into chaos and noise. In the stunned, ringing silence that followed the thunderclap, Elias began to move. He did not draw a weapon. He did not shout. He simply started walking, slowly, deliberately, straight toward Noah Pike. His eyes never left the barrel of the gun. Every line of his body communicated a single, unshakable purpose. He was not going to stop. Pike's eyes were wide, his knuckles white on the grip of his pistol. He centered the barrel on Elias's chest. "Stop," he croaked. "I will shoot." Elias kept walking. "From the side?" Hannah's voice cut through the tension, not loud, but clear and calm. "Noah." She said, "Put it down." Pike's head jerked toward her, his concentration broken for a fraction of a second. She looked past him, her gaze finding Tommy, who stood pale and wide-eyed behind his uncle. "You would not want the boy to see," she said, her voice soft with a strange, sad pity. "You would not want him to see you do this." Her words struck a target deep inside him, a last buried vestige of shame. He was not a monster in his own eyes. He was a hard man, a tough man, but he was not the kind of man who would gun down another in front of a child. His resolve wavered. The barrel of his gun dipped, just an inch, but it was enough. The spell was broken. The men in the crowd, their fear replaced by a surge of collective anger, surged forward. They surrounded Pike, a human tide of rough hands and grim faces. Someone grabbed his wrist, twisting until the gun fell harmlessly into the dust. Judge Carraway, seeing his authority evaporate, tried to slip away, to melt into the confusion, but his hired men, seeing which way the wind was blowing, simply turned and walked away, abandoning him on the steps. The sheriff, his face a mask of profound relief, stepped forward and put a hand on the judge's arm. "I think you and I need to have a talk, Judge." And then the rain came. It started as a few fat, heavy drops, then became a downpour, a torrential, cleansing flood. It soaked their clothes and plastered their hair to their heads, washing the dust from the air and the fear from their faces. In the midst of the chaos, Elias, Hannah, and Tommy found themselves standing together. The crowd was no longer looking at Hannah as a stranger, an outcast. They were looking at her with a newfound respect, as one of their own. Pike was disarmed. Carraway was defeated, and the rain, hard and clean and honest, was washing the whole sordid mess away. The rain that had washed the truth clean also seemed to wash the poison from the air. In the days that followed the public judgment of Judge Carraway and Noah Pike, a new, tentative sense of order began to settle over Dusty Mesa. The fear that had held the town in its grip for so long had been broken, and in its place, a fragile but determined spirit of cooperation was taking root. Carraway was being held in the town jail, his empire of intimidation crumbling as the sheriff, with a newfound sense of duty, began the slow process of untangling his web of fraudulent deals and threats, preparing a formal report for the circuit judge. The first and most important piece of business was the water. At a town meeting, a real one this time, held inside the hall with the windows open to the clean air, a new water committee was formed. It was not a committee of one, but of many. Elias Boone sat at the table, not as a pariah, but as a respected voice. Beside him were two other ranchers who had long chafed under Carraway's control, and with them sat Father Deacon Miller, his moral compass a guide for them all, and Maya Redbird, whose quiet wisdom and deep knowledge of the land were finally being given the respect they deserved. They spent a long afternoon poring over old maps and water rights documents, and when they were finished, they had a plan. It was a simple, fair plan that ensured every ranch had the access it needed to survive. Boone Creek would once again flow as it should, its use shared, not owned. The long drought of the soul was beginning to break. Life at the ranch settled into a new rhythm, one marked by a quiet sense of peace. The work was still hard, the days still long, but the gnawing anxiety that had underscored every action was gone. There was a lightness in the air, a feeling of a burden lifted. Tommy, who had found a deep well of courage within himself, seemed to stand a little taller. He spent hours in the barn, not just doing his chores, but working on a secret project. He was often covered in wood shavings, a small, determined frown on his face as he worked with his father's old carving tools. One evening, as they were finishing supper, he brought his project into the cookhouse. It was a sign, carved from a smooth, weathered piece of cottonwood. The letters were a little uneven, carved with the earnest imperfection of a boy's hand. But the words were clear. He had painted them carefully in black. It read, Hannah's Table, and underneath, in smaller letters, Warm Bread, Warm Hearts. He held it out to Hannah, his face flushed with a mixture of pride and shyness. For the kitchen, he said, because it is yours now. Hannah took the sign from him, her fingers tracing the carved letters. She looked at the words, at the simple, profound sentiment they expressed. It was more than just a piece of wood. It was a deed, a title. It was a declaration that this was her place, her home. A slow, warm wave of emotion washed over her, so powerful it almost took her breath away. She could not speak. She simply put her hand on the boy's shoulder and squeezed, her eyes shining with a light Elias had never seen before. He watched the two of them, a strange tightness in his own chest, a feeling so full of gratitude and pride it felt like a kind of prayer. A few days later, Hannah made a decision. Sal had approached her about selling some of her bread and pies at the upcoming autumn market fair. At first, Hannah had hesitated. The thought of putting herself on display, of facing the townspeople, still sparked a flicker of the old fear. But then she looked at Tommy's sign, which now hung proudly over the cookhouse door, and she thought of Maya's quiet strength and Sal's fierce loyalty. She was not a stranger here anymore. I would like that very much, she told Sal. That afternoon, she went into the small storeroom that had been her sanctuary. It was still her room, but it no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a beginning. She knelt and opened the small wooden crate that held her things. At the very bottom was the small, worn cloth sack she had arrived with. It held a change of clothes, her mother's locket, and the few coins she had in the world. For years, that bag had been her only constant, always packed, the drawstring tied in a tight, ready knot. It was the bag of a woman who knew she might have to leave in the middle of the night. Slowly, deliberately, she unpacked it. She folded the clothes and placed them in the crate. She put the locket on the small shelf by her pallet. She took the bag, now empty, folded it neatly, and placed it at the bottom of the crate. For the first time in years, she did not tie the drawstring. She was not running anymore. She was staying. Elias, too, was changing. The hard, angry shell he had built around himself was beginning to crack, letting in the light. He still worked with a fierce intensity, but the angry, explosive frustration was gone, replaced by a deep, steady patience. He was learning a new language, the quiet language of presence. One evening, a strong north wind kicked up, a reminder of the storm that had almost destroyed them. It howled around the corners of the house and rattled the window panes, the same kind of wind that would once have sent a charge of tension through the rooms. The three of them were at the table in the main house, reading by the light of a kerosene lamp. The sound of the wind rose to a deafening shriek. Elias felt the old, familiar instinct to tense up, to brace for a fight. He saw Hannah's shoulders tighten, her eyes flicker toward the door. But this time something was different. Instead of slamming his hand on the table or letting out a frustrated sigh, Elias did something else. He slowly, deliberately, placed his hand flat on the wooden surface of the table. It was not a gesture of anger, but of grounding, an anchor in the storm. He looked at Hannah, then at Tommy, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They sat there for a long time, listening as the wind raged outside. But it was only wind. It had no power over them anymore. They were safe inside, together, and no one was afraid. Autumn deepened, painting the cottonwood leaves a brilliant gold and bringing a crisp, clean chill to the night air. The harvest was in. The cattle were fattening on the late-season grass, and a feeling of peace had settled over the valley. The work of the day was done, and Elias and Hannah sat on the porch steps, watching the stars begin to appear in the vast, dark sky. It had become their ritual, a time of shared silence that was more comfortable than any conversation. A cool breeze swept across the yard, and Hannah shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Without a word, Elias got up and went inside. He came back a moment later carrying a heavy, dark blue wool blanket. It was old and faded, one that his wife had favored on cold nights. He unfolded it and gently draped it over Hannah's shoulders, his large, rough hands lingering for a moment on the soft wool. She looked up at him, her face softened by the pale moonlight. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered. As he went to sit back down, his hand brushed against hers. He stopped. He did not pull away. Instead, his fingers closed gently around hers. Her hand was small in his, but her grip was firm, her skin warm. They sat there for a long time, side by side in the cool autumn night, the old blue blanket a shared warmth around them. They held hands, not with the passionate fire of new lovers, but with the quiet, solid comfort of two people who had found a safe harbor in each other. There were no vows spoken, no promises of forever made. There was only the simple, profound truth of the moment. They were here, together, and they would stay. The arrival of the circuit judge from Santa Fe was not a dramatic event, but a quiet, methodical turning of a page. He was a man with spectacles and a weary, patient face. A man who dealt not in rumor but in ledgers and sworn testimony. The investigation was brief, faced with Sal's freight invoice, the testimony of the sheriff, and the damning evidence of his own account books. Judge Carraway's empire of bluster collapsed into a pile of incriminating facts. He was found to have engaged in a long pattern of extortion and bribery. Noah Pike, stripped of his protector's power, quickly confessed to the charge of threatening with a deadly weapon in exchange for a lesser sentence. The anonymous witness, of course, never materialized. The official report declared Hannah Gray a victim of circumstance, entirely cleared of any wrongdoing. And just like that, the whispers that had haunted the valley died, starved of the lies that had fed them. The story was over. The truth had taken its place. The autumn market fair was held on a bright, cloudless day. The air was crisp with the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the entire valley seemed to have turned out. The dusty clearing in the center of town was transformed into a bustling hub of commerce and community. Farmers displayed their prize pumpkins, ranchers traded horses, and children chased each other through the crowds, their laughter ringing in the clear air. At a small stall near the meeting hall, under a canvas awning, stood Hannah's table. The sign Tommy had carved was hung in the center, and the table itself was laden with Hannah's creations, crusty loaves of sourdough, neat rows of sweet cornbread muffins, and deep dish apple pies whose cinnamon scent was a siren call to everyone who passed. Hannah stood behind the table, an apron tied around her waist, her face flushed with a nervous excitement. Sal stood beside her, a formidable and loyal ally, calling out to passers-by and making change from a wooden box. Elias and Tommy were not far away. They leaned against a nearby wagon, pretending to be nonchalant, but their eyes rarely left the stall. They watched as people approached, hesitantly at first, Then, with more confidence, they saw a rancher who had been one of the loudest voices against Elias buy a whole pie. They saw the mothers of the boys who had taunted Tommy come and purchase muffins for their children. Each transaction was more than just a sale. It was a small act of apology, an admission of error, a quiet gesture of welcome. By midday, the table was nearly empty. Tommy walked over. Grabbing the last muffin, he took a large bite, his cheeks puffing out. "It is a good thing you are here," he said to Hannah, his voice muffled by the muffin. "If it were not for all this bread, I think this whole ranch would just fall asleep again." Hannah laughed, a real, unburdened sound that made Elias's heart ache in a good way. Elias walked over and put a hand on the boy's head, ruffling his hair. "I think you might be right about that, son," he said, his eyes meeting Hannah's over the boy's head. They packed up the empty baskets and the wooden sign, their movements easy and familiar. They were not just a rancher and his cook and his nephew anymore. They were a family, forged not by blood, but by fire and storms and the simple, stubborn act of standing together. That evening, the ranch was quiet. Tommy was asleep, tired out from the excitement of the fair. The lamp in the cookhouse cast a warm, golden glow. Hannah sat at the table. In front of her were 2 books. One was the old, grease-stained notebook she had carried with her for years, its pages soft and worn, filled with her hurried script. The other was a new, clean ledger with a sturdy cover, a gift from Sal. Slowly, methodically, she began to copy her recipes from the old book into the new one. It was a quiet, ceremonial act. She was not just transcribing lists of ingredients and instructions. She was transferring her past into her future. The recipes for survival, the meals cooked in fear and uncertainty, were now becoming the foundations of a home. When she had finished, she took the old book and placed it at the very back of a cupboard. She would not throw it away. It was a part of her story, but it was not a part she needed to read every day. She opened the new ledger to the first clean, empty page. She dipped a pen in the inkwell, and in her neat, careful hand, she wrote 2 words: "Beginning today." Later, she found Elias on the porch, staring out at the star-filled sky. She came and stood beside him, wrapping her shawl around her against the night's chill. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, the kind of silence that does not need to be filled. Elias cleared his throat. He did not look at her, but kept his gaze on the distant, silent mountains. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough, unadorned with any poetry he did not possess. "This place," he said, "it was just a piece of land, a house. After Sarah died, it went dark. I was just going through the motions. There was no light on inside?" He finally turned to look at her, his clear blue eyes searching her face in the pale starlight. "When you are here, this place has a light on." It was the truest, most beautiful thing he had ever said. It was a confession, a declaration, and a plea, all in one simple, unadorned sentence. Hannah did not look away. She did not need to make a grand promise or a sweeping vow. Her life had taught her that promises could be broken and vows could be empty. All that mattered was the solid, unshakable truth of the present moment. She gave him a small, soft smile, a smile that reached her eyes and lit them from within. "I am here," she said. Dawn broke over the high desert, a breathtaking wash of rose and gold against the dark red earth. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of dry grass and damp soil, a promise of the day's warmth. At Boone Creek Ranch, a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney of the cookhouse. The windmill, which had once groaned and squealed in protest, now turned with a steady, quiet rhythm, its blades catching the first light of the sun as it pumped cool, clear water from the ground. Inside, on a wooden table, sat a loaf of freshly baked bread, its crust a perfect golden brown, its warmth filling the small room with the smell of life, of sustenance, of home, love. Hannah had learned, did not always arrive like a thunderclap or a prairie fire. Sometimes It came as quietly as the dawn. Sometimes, it was as simple and as necessary as warm bread on the table, arriving just when you had forgotten you were hungry. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.